All right, lots to discuss. Mets coming off a solid weekend in San Diego. We'll talk about the takeaways from that. And also, we have a guy on the podcast this week who has written a book that is making headlines. We're lucky to have him as a guest on this podcast. It's a special guest. You're just going to want to wait and find out who is joining this episode of the Shea Anything podcast. It starts right now.
You must have a really good booker, Doug.
Welcome to the show, everybody. A reminder to subscribe to the Shea Anything podcast at Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. We appreciate it. Another reminder, it's brought to you by Verizon. It's 5G built right for the Mets, from the network more people rely on, only on Verizon. In case you guessed it, which I'm guessing most of you did, Andy, who is a regular on this here program, is the also aforementioned author that I mentioned of Cheated. I have it in front of me like I'm doing a TV show. I'm showing it on the screen, even though you're all listening and you can't see it.
You all just heard the sound of a man holding up a book.
Yes, it is. It's really good. And, you know, if you're a baseball fan, you followed that story really closely, which just makes it such a good subject matter for Andy to write about, because everyone has unanswered questions. And there's no one that has had maybe, you know, Astros homers don't want to hear about it anymore, but everybody else wants to hear about it. And Andy, I guarantee you that even Astros homers are buying the book, because you want to know, what are people saying about my team that so anyway, we'll get into all of that.
A lot of Mets in there too, which is why we're talking about it today. A lot of Mets content.
A lot of Mets stuff, and we'll get to that and those specifics that Andy writes about. Lots of stuff about Carlos Beltran. When the Mets hired him, their decision to eventually let him go, what went into that, the communication was really interesting. But first, let's talk contemporary Mets. Andy, it just continues to be more and more obvious. It seems like every week that your original point remains true. The Mets are just a good team. And even not even close to full strength, even on days where they're resting Pete Alonso in San Diego, and it looks like the game's over before it starts, they find ways to either keep games close or win them. And I'm just curious if you had the same reaction that I did from the West Coast trips, where you're like, yeah, this is just a good team playing good baseball and potentially running away with the division.
Sometimes you can just feel it and see it. You know, Yankees, Red Sox, Sunday Night Baseball. You looked in the Red Sox dugout and you were just like, that's a team that believes in itself and it's got a certain something going. And the Mets are just the same way. And that's just it. So, yeah, they have, obviously, you can feel really good about yourself, but have bad players, and that doesn't help you. The Mets have a lot of good players. They're playing well. They have we don't have to be great analysts here to see. You can see it. They're just playing well. Their depth is playing well. They have a certain spirit and spunk to them right now. And, they have a manager who's developing before our eyes, improving all the time, I think. Everything is just clicking into place, and they're just having a big year so far. Anything could change, blah, blah, blah. But as I said last week, I feel like I'm at the point where we can say we'd be pretty surprised if we weren't doing Shea Anything Mets playoff edition at some point in October.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think
we should do it live in front of the ballpark. Jeff, can we do a live Shea Anything at City out front before the playoff game? Yes.
Thank you.
Isn't that fun? Wouldn't that be fun?
I'm going to take that to mean Jeff nodding his head on mute, that is set in stone, will be paid for and done. So
yes.
Thank
you, Verizon.
Thank you, Verizon. Okay, so that's the first of the three batter rule. Just our impressions coming off that split in San Diego. It sounds like you and I are on the same page. I'm going to call an audible here because, look, I think it's interesting to talk about this Mets team being what it's going to be for the next couple of weeks. I mean, the Mets may get Guillorme and Almora back soon.
I'm hearing some, not to interrupt you, but I'm hearing some optimism on McNeil too.
Okay.
So he may be healing a little faster than expected.
That's good news, because we had heard both he and Conforto had significant injuries. But I'm just curious to pick your brain for our second three batter rule on deGrom, because I'm curious to know, you and I have now done a couple of, you've been part of the Cy Young shows, right? When he won them, you were
Except for the time I was in the emergency room with a kidney stone. That one I
Right.
missed.
Okay. So,
That's
we've done a couple of these.
Yeah.
We know that he's great. We knew going into the season that he was great. Has there been an extra added layer to you watching him this year where you're like, wow? Like for me, in my case, I've watched him pitch a couple times with my family, and I've been like, deGrom's pitching. Like everybody, this is the best I think I've ever seen. Have you had that type of experience this year watching him?
Yeah, probably, because it seems like the hitters have no chance. I mean, obviously, the obvious is that the velocity's ticked up even more. So that certainly is a big factor. Um, yes, it does seem to be up a level this year. One thing I find interesting is that he's very predictable to opposing hitters. The Padres game actually being an exception. He threw most of his pitches early in the game, but usually they way different from a Garrett Cole or a Trevor Bauer. When you face DeGrom, you know what you're going to get. It's fastballs for the first 3 innings with the occasional secondary pitch. I mean, you watch the games. Then you'll mix in the slider, then unders the changeup. It's like pretty much like you don't have to steal his signs. It doesn't matter if he's tipping. You kind of know what he's going to throw. He starts reading swings too, like later in the game. So I find that interesting that he's so predictable and yet more and more dominant. It just goes to, I guess, the unhittability of the stuff. And again, in the Padres game, I actually didn't think he had his best stuff, especially early on. And like his command of the slider wasn't great. And like he was through like he was trying to throw a front door slider and it slipped into becoming a back foot slider. Like he just wasn't hitting his spots quite the same way, but it actually didn't create any better results for the Padres.
No.
So I guess he's just that dominant. I mean, he's been amazing, obviously, consistently. But yeah, it just right now it just doesn't seem like he's in a place where he could possibly give up any runs. So yes, I guess that's another.
That's the weird part is it's an amazing stat that his ERA is what? It's in the point. Is it in the 0.5s now?
I thought it was in the 0.6s, but you could be right.
I thought, yeah, maybe it's in the point. I'm going to look it up right now as we speak, so you won't really have. Okay, so deGrom's 0.62.
Okay.
And I think he started at like 0.71. It seems unfair at how little it goes down, but that's why it's so difficult.
Well, it's only so
exactly.
Much
it's
to
only
zero
so close to zero, but it does. It's a kind of perfect way to put it. It seems impossible for other teams to score, which is the ultimate way to compliment a pitcher. And I think, I guess part of it is he is in a contract where, I'm not feeling sorry for him. He's making a ton of money every year, but he's not in the type of contract that he probably deserves comparatively to Trevor Bauer or anybody else, which isn't his fault or Brody Van Wagenen's fault or anybody.
Fault. Hey, if it's not for Brody Van Wagenen, honestly, Jacob deGrom is making $300+ million to pitch for another team right now. He was a free agent last winter, with no Brody. So, I mean, that's quite a gift he left behind for the
You don't
Mets.
think another GM would have signed him to that deal?
No, that was Brody with the relationship with the player, with the agency, and with Jeff Wilpon and Fred Wilpon, leveraging all those relationships into a big win for the Mets.
Well, yeah, and it wasn't just a win because you signed the player. Like sometimes we applaud contracts right when they happen. It's a win because now it looks like a bargain, obviously. Right. So what's this like being Zach Scott, Sandy Alderson, Steve Cohen, watching him pitch on this contract you're lucky to have him under, but knowing that you're going to have to do something?
Well, they tried to make a run at him in the spring, as you know. They whatever. I don't have the number that deGrom's new agents, no coincidence, asked for, and it wasn't anything that the Mets considered close to reasonable, whatever they asked for. So they've got to either figure that out, let him walk when he's a little older in a year and a half, or overpay him to turn 40 because it's just what you have to do and let him retire a Met. I guess those are your options.
What is unreasonable for a pitcher to ask for who doesn't give up runs?
Well, that was before he did. This isn't spring training. He gave up few runs. Now he gives up no runs.
It's like
I don't know. I don't know the number, but I know that at his age, if he's asking for a Cole type contract, the Cole got about to turn 30, deGrom 32 into 33 season. Perhaps if you're looking for 9 years or something at 30-ish a year, like deGrom has every right to ask for more than Garrett Cole. He's a little bit better. But if you're the Mets, you're thinking age, you might consider that unreasonable.
Yeah.
Speculating here.
Okay, third of the 3-batter rule. This has also been trending in a good direction, although Francisco Lindor does still make outs where deGrom doesn't give up runs. But Lindor certainly seems like he's trending in the right direction, Andy. Just seems like he's got more confidence. Every time he hit the home run in San Diego, and, you can tell he's celebrating around the bases, but I'm sure it's even more relief than jubilation.
Mm-hmm.
If you, maybe you disagree with this, but let's say we're past the worst of it and it's only going to get better from here. Do you think that in the past couple months, there has been some legitimate doubt inside the Mets front office that this thing would turn around, that he would be that player he was in Cleveland again?
I haven't asked that. I will admit, I haven't asked that direct question of anyone in the Mets front office, although it's a good one. I will say that signing him to that deal was not something that there was a ton of sabermetric process attached to. There wasn't a whole ton of evaluating, hey, what kind of player is he? How does he project out? What about his skill set? What about his underlying numbers? It was more like big fish, reel in the big fish. Yay, we got him. It was kind of like that a little bit. So in that sense, and they knew they're not stupid. They knew some of the trends since 19 offensively that he's been on, which have not been good. So anyone would be surprised by how much he struggled. But I think they all basically also felt like it was early enough to where it was reasonable to hope it got better, and it appears to be getting better. I found his comment about maybe I won't get booed at home to be pretty revealing. Not a great quote, really, but not his worst quote this year. But it showed. I'm hesitant to talk about players' confidence when I don't know them really well personally, but that was a real tip. Clearly, this thing is in your head. If you're bringing up maybe I won't get booed at home, he must be really struggling with the way he's been perceived. So it has to be a factor. These guys are humans.
And I think maybe part of that, just to play devil's advocate, is the fact that he's talking to the media, and the media asked him a million questions about getting booed. So it's like, yeah, maybe it is in his head, but he knows.
Talking about, sorry to interrupt, the superstar of his area in Caguas, Puerto Rico. You're talking about the hero of the Cleveland Indians, where nobody boos, I don't think, much. And then you get here and it's like, whoa, you suck in New York, blah, blah, blah. So I don't know. I think he does seem a little taken aback by that.
Yeah. And it goes against your theory early on in the year when, he made that error and he was like, yeah, here's what I did wrong. It won't happen again. Brushed it aside. You were like, that's a player with confidence in his ability. Mm-hmm. Maybe he's still dealing with the feeling of getting booed in a home ballpark that isn't, cheering you on. I mean, that in and of itself sounds so simple to us, but we haven't played, so we don't really realize what that's like.
It hits some guys differently than others. And maybe he had that confidence when we had that discussion early in the season, and, several weeks of being a non-competitive hitter with a $341 million contract would probably put a dent in your confidence short term.
Yeah. And you're right that confidence can ebb and flow. It's interesting that you thought that was revealing, and not just because of what we were talking about with his confidence early in the season with a defensive play, but also because when he did address the booing, he seemed so, easy going about it. And he's got this thing where it's like Terry Collins told him, hey, the media likes it when you say people's names when they ask questions. So we've talked about this, but every time somebody asks a question on Zoom, he goes, Andy, yeah, yes, like it's like he takes a pause, he says the name, another pause, and then he answers it. So he was like, Yeah, it sucks, Andy, but I don't know. That's just my Francisco Lindor impression.
Well, look, it's polite. So what the heck?
Yeah,
There are worse
what the heck?
things.
I like it. Whenever Terry says my name on Baseball Night in New York, I get a little like, wow, that's Terry Collins.
Exactly. And that's they should it doesn't take much to flatter one of us. More of them should realize that.
Okay. I got through the Mets stuff quickly because I want to talk book. You're listening to the Shea Anything podcast, brought to you by Verizon. It's 5G built right for the Mets from the network more people rely on, only on Verizon. The question that and by the way, just some background. It's called Cheated. It's the inside story of the Astros Scandal, colorful history of sign stealing. And when Andy says history on the cover, he means it. He starts from the very beginning and talks about where this is coming from. We know the technology is new and different. We know that that's why it was illegal, but it's not a new concept. And Andy, remind these kind folks listening what time this book that I'm holding up what date?
It comes out on Tuesday, which is tomorrow from where we're recording. I think if you ordered it on Kindle, it pops in tomorrow. If you've pre-ordered it on any of the places one orders a book online, you'll get it in the mail tomorrow, I think, and bookstores, anywhere you buy books, tomorrow's the day. And
it's also
we've run excerpts already if you're interested on our website. Mets Fix was nice enough to do an excerpt today, so
it was interesting because the cover is so, the words cheated are so large, and it's such an interesting word with so many different connotations. And I finished it late last night, and if I hadn't, I was going to bring it on the subway because I had a doctor's appointment uptown today. And I was thinking, this is the type of book that I feel like people would ask me about while I was in the like, what is that?
Nice job with the dramatic cover. I agree.
It is a dramatic cover. So, Andy, the question that came to my mind while I was reading it. This is a tough one. Putting you on the spot.
Okay.
Name the one person that, from your takeaway from writing this book, the biggest contributor to the Astros scandal.
Jeff Luhnow. And I say that this is going to be a complex answer because he was not directly involved in the creation of the trash can banging scheme. That was Alex Cora and Carlos Beltran, two people who I really respect in a lot of ways, but it is what it is. Those two guys are intimately involved in that. But one of the reasons it was allowed to happen in the first place was because Jeff Luhnow ran an organization that was ruthless in its desire for innovation. Luhnow would hold meetings with his staff at the end of every year. What new ideas do you have? What new ideas do you have? So there was this relentless pressure to innovate, which came from lower level members of the front office starting to figure out how to do that code breaker thing where in the replay room, which by the way, wasn't that big of a deal. They were logging signs into a Excel spreadsheet, but it's just like, okay, like Luhnow's not like, how can we steal signs? But he's like, come up with something all the time. If you're not innovating, you're losing, just pressuring people. So there was in an amoral environment too, where it wasn't about what's right or wrong. That was not the discussion. The discussion was how can we win? So that was the environment that Alex Cora took the bench job in 2017, bench coach job in 2017, and Beltran signed as a veteran player in 2017. But they get there, they notice, they tell their Astros teammates, they say, guys, your sign sequences are way too easy to figure out. Beltran said on spring training, I can pick them up from second base. Last year when I was with the Rangers, Yankees, we know your signs. Tighten it up. And sort of from there was a lot of talk about signs, and it became by May 26th, I believe was the first day it started of that year. It became a historic cheating scheme, but there was a culture that those guys walked into that helped to make it happen.
And to your point about culture, one of the really, toxic parts of the work environment that you described that Luhnow has underneath them is the fact that everyone, players, employees, interns, everybody's kind of just a number to him. That's the way his brain works. So like the reason Codebreaker was brought to him by an intern was just an intern trying to get Jeff Luhnow to know who he was.
That's right.
It just felt like that was the vibe. It was like, can I bring something to this guy that will impress him and make him remember me and make sure that I stay here and maybe I become part of his inner circle. So let's talk Beltran, because you mentioned that Luhnow is, really the main person responsible, and underneath him are the orchestrators in Cora and Beltran. Now, Andy gets into in the book his hiring from the Mets, his eventual firing, or the agreement to have Carlos Beltran no longer firing. Okay. So what I find interesting is you described Terry Collins picking up the phone at one point, and Terry's been texting with Carlos and is close with Carlos, and Terry's pissed off. He has a couple drinks, and he's on the phone with somebody just being like, I feel like my friend in baseball got screwed.
Yeah.
So how is that the truth, Andy? How do people feel like Beltran got screwed when he's one of the two names and the only name listed in the Manfred report?
Well, that's one of the reasons
that orchestrated it.
It's like, why is his name in that report? It was one of the things that really bothered his friends. Look, Carlos Beltran is a fascinating figure. He's the guy who captivated me the most as a subject in writing the book. I've known this guy a long time. He is somebody who started out as a very surly, reserved guy, kind of difficult to cover, blossomed into an unbelievably outgoing, warm person, took a job that he didn't need as the Mets manager. I remember talking to him on the field. It's funny, at Minute Maid Park in the 2019 ALCS, because he was in the Yankees front office traveling with the Yankees while interviewing for the Mets job. And I said, basically, Carlos, you got all the money in the world. You got a beautiful family. You got a cushy job with the Yankees where you can show up when you want to. Why in the world would you want to manage the Mets? Like, what's wrong with you? You have a great life. And he's like, I know, brother, but I just want to help these young players. And he was going to donate his salary to his foundation with him. He was doing it like in an industry where it's all about money and selfishness. He was actually managing the Mets because he wanted to do good. Really. I think he wanted to prove himself as a smart baseball guy too, and redeem himself for some of the fans and all that stuff. But he really, really cares about players. And that has made him somebody who really stood up for players' rights through the years. In 2000, when he was a young player, he was on the Royals. The Royals wanted him to rehab when he was on the DL and in their spring training complex. He wanted to do it in Kansas City. He and Scott Boras fight the team, fight the league. Next thing you know, teams have to start spending more money for better rehab facilities. Owners are like, thanks, Beltran, right? 14 years later, he and Omar Minaya, our friend, and some people at the union spearhead the rule that MLB people need translators. MLB teams need translators for Spanish-speaking players. I remember I was in the clubhouse in Tampa. Beltran was a Yankee. The Yankees say Ivan Nova needs Tommy John. I happened to be there that series. Ivan Nova gives a news conference, whatever you want to call it, around his locker. He says, no, everything's okay. It's okay. And then we're like, does he know he needs Tommy John surgery? And he's like, well, he asks Jorge Castillo, a reporter, to say in Spanish what the Yankees told us. And he's like, oh. And Beltran looks at me, calls me over. He's sitting in his locker across the room. He goes, hey, what's going on over there? And I told him. And he's like, this has got to get cleaned up. This guy doesn't understand what's going on. And the Yankees are putting him out there to talk to reporters. Beltran forces a rule that teams have to create a salaried employee for a translator because he thinks it's the right thing to do. That's another knock against him with some people in the establishment in baseball. He's making every team create a paid position, right? He's pushing for player rights. All these things were things that people wondered, friends of his wondered, why is his name in that report? Was it this thing that he did? Was it that thing that he did? None of these things are provable, but that was a lot of the thought and the talk around him. And when you have a context where there's a sign-stealing era, there are players in the Astros, almost all of them participating in it, players on other teams participating in other various kinds of sign-stealing, and Carlos Beltran's the only name in the report when they weren't naming any players. If you're someone who loves and cares for Carlos Beltran like Terry Collins does, you're going to be like, what the bleep? Why did they do this to my friend who now can't take this job that he wanted to do out of the goodness of his heart, managing the Mets? It was a heartbreaking thing for people who cared for Carlos Beltran. And then there was a line that said players, including Carlos Beltran, were involved. It's like, including Carlos Beltran? What about including Alex Bregman? What about including? It's like, what? And that was the reaction people were having. That's when Brody read that, when he read the report. He reads the report. His manager is Carlos Beltran, right? It's like January. It says players, including Carlos Beltran. Brody Van Wagenen's like, uh-oh, my manager's singled out in this report. So Brody and Jeff Wilpon call the commissioner's office. Can we get a meeting to discuss this? They go to the commissioner's office, and they're basically told, look, this was not great, what Beltran was involved in there. And that's true. It wasn't. But in terms of so for Terry to think that Carlos got screwed as part friendship and loyalty.
Right.
I mean, he did it. Beltran did it, but.
So when Brody heard the news, Andy, he reached directly out to Carlos, could not get him on the phone, according to your book.
And I was with Brody that day. He was frustrated.
And so do you think that even after days of deliberating, which you describe in the book, that him and Jeff Wilpon and Allard Baird, everybody trying to figure out if they should fire Beltran, do you think that if Beltran returns his call and is empathetic and explains his part in it right away, that it winds up differently?
Yes, that would have helped. I don't know if it would have saved his job, but it would have helped a lot because Brody, Jeff Wilpon, Allard, Omar, they needed a connection to Beltran. They need to be like, look me in the eye and tell me this is going to be okay kind of moment, you know? And they felt that connection prior. That's why they hired him. So this happens. We're at the GM meetings. Brody's all mad because it's like he's getting questions about this. And he's like, this is not a Mets story. It was because his manager was involved. But he's trying to get Beltran on the phone to say, don't talk to anyone, especially the media, before you talk to me. Beltran's on vacation in Iceland with his wife that was planned. So it wasn't that big a deal that they couldn't get a hold of him in their minds. Then Brody's in the like on his Uber on the way to the airport. And he sees an article on his phone, a tweet, Beltran denying aspects of the scandal to Joel Sherman. Okay, Joel got him and I didn't, and I'm his GM. And that started to be the feeling of like, I'm losing the connection here, like if you're Brody. So that didn't help. And even a couple months later, when they had him in that long meeting all night, trying to connect with him and figure out if they can keep him, they weren't feeling it. Like they were feeling like he was just a little bit like, what's the big deal here, guys? And I think Beltran probably just couldn't get past, there was a sign stealing era. Why am I the bad guy? And I think that two things can be true. He can be guilty and he can be singled out. And I think that's what he was probably feeling.
It's another thing that you describe in the book that's fascinating, that Beltran wasn't alone in thinking that everybody else was doing it. It was something that everyone in the Astros organization, not everybody, but you know what I mean, kept saying, everyone's doing this. And they would almost convince themselves they've got our signs, when in reality, no one's doing it as intricately as you are.
Much. No, there was a player quickly, and because I know we have one more thing we want to get to. There was an ex-Astros player who told me in 2020 regarding 17. He was like, look, it was like there was a curtain around us, and we were like, everyone's doing it. And then the curtain came down, and we looked around, and it was like we were, not everyone's doing it. And that kind of, I don't know that Beltran ever quite got there to say not everyone else is doing it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I don't know if you have or haven't already, if you're listening to this, but the book is probably maybe out. It comes out on Tuesday, the 8th. And it's called Cheated. It's by Andy Martino. You should buy it. And look, he gets deeper into more Mets related stuff than we even discussed. Bobby Valentine is very much in it. So there's a lot of angles that you'll find interesting, no matter how into the sign stealing Astros story you were when it came out. Speaking of cheating, Andy, and this is something we want to touch on before we go, because it's something that seems like it's really at the forefront of what's going on in Major League Baseball right now. Garrett Cole's spin rate was way down in his last start.
Bauer as well.
Yeah. Bauer as well coincides with the headlines that we're seeing that MLB is cracking down on foreign substances. So my main question here, and if you can help me out, it would be great. Who knows at this point? Is this like a steroid suspension, and they know they're going to get suspended, but it's not public yet? Like, do pitchers know they're in trouble, or are they trying to preempt it because they know that trouble is coming if they don't?
I think it's more the latter. This is going to be less of a scandal historically than steroids or the Astros. One reason is that is because this aggressive crackdown is coming before a big scandal or a big suspension or a big expose. I mean, there have been media articles written, obviously, about it that have helped push the commissioner, but no one knows exactly how discipline's going to play out and how much the union's going to fight it in this. I think, though, you'll probably see a few suspensions coming soon based on stuff that was confiscated or inspected in upcoming games. I think when you see spin rates drop, you can fairly probably extrapolate that guys are now trying not to get punished. It's unclear. It's a good question whether data collected on a pitcher like Bauer or Cole or anyone else could result in a punishment going forward, or if it's just like, okay, now that hasn't actually been announced or finalized yet, but it seems like the behaviors are changing already with the foreign substances. Now that MLB is making clear they're going to crack down, clubs are cracking down, GMs don't want to get in trouble like Jeff Lunau did, so they're going to be policing their own organizations. And I actually don't think this one's going to have a lot more legs than what we've already seen, because they actually are getting out ahead of it a little bit.
Right. I was about to say, everything feels a little more out there in the open.
Yeah.
Because there's so many examples of things that we've seen with our own eyes.
Yep.
Like, we weren't sitting watching the 2017 Astros at home, the layman being like, no, it seems like they have their signs. But any baseball fan, if you watch the game a lot over the past 5 years, 10 years, you've seen pitchers grab the bill of their cap that's a different color than the rest of the hat, or reach into their glove. Like, we've all known this is going on. We now know that it's probably at an extent that Major League Baseball wants it to end. So I agree with you. It doesn't reek of scandal to me, but I am interested to see if some rando pitcher gets the first suspension, or if it's a big name. Because right. We're saying Bauer and Cole. We're only saying that because they're superstar pitchers, and they have been, rumored to have their spin rates down, given some whispers about them on the side.
Well, and to be fair, Bauer's basically said he's done it. Cole has basically had a smoking gun email of him asking for a sticky substance from a clubby. But they've both commented in recent days, like, we just want a fair playing field. So there's that idea that, maybe you were doing it because that's just what pitchers were doing. It's a before and after thing. You remember, you just read my book, so you'll remember that with regard to sign stealing, there's before and after September 15th, 2017. That's when Manfred issued a memo saying sign stealing has always been a wink, wink. Now it's not. Now there's punishments. So if you did it before or after, that's big. So I just think that's where we are with this issue. And I just don't think, like, the smell test of scandal, like, if you know that a player's shooting steroids and hit 70 home runs, that might bother you. If you knew that a bang on a trash can, that might bother you. If you have a pitcher rubbing up a ball with something, you might be like, okay, well, I guess they should stop. But it doesn't have the feel to me of a earth-shattering scandal.
I agree. And then if you tell somebody who barely watches the game that story, they're going to be like, isn't there a bag of powder outside the mound? And don't batters have their bats covered in pine? Like, it just doesn't feel as unique.
It doesn't have enough. It's impactful, and they should stop because hitters can't hit anymore. But I think they will stop now.
Once again, you've been listening to the Shea Anything podcast. It's brought to you by Verizon. It's 5G built right for the Mets from the network more people rely on, only on Verizon. Please subscribe, rate, and review to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And a reminder that you got to buy Cheated by Andy Martino, the inside story, the Astros Scandal, and colorful history of sign stealing. Andy, thank you. Everybody will, I'm sure, look forward to reading it, and we appreciate the insight into some of the stuff you wrote about. We'll talk to you later this week, everybody. Thanks, as always, for listening.